All right, on to the video that I was going to make. Besides the on Friday afternoons, Algo wants me to convert to something I'm not quite sure what. I was watching the conversation I had with Benjamin a few weeks ago, and I remember when he said this, I didn't understand it, and so I want to come back to it because let's see where this goes. So I think that's directly tied to my theological heritage.
Yeah, I was speaking with man, I'm so bad with names. I just published it too. He wrote a book called Joe Rigney.
Oh yeah.
Wrote a book called The Sin of Empathy. We talked about empathy, and he defined it in a specific way, and he titled it that, knowing that it would cause a stir because that's what a good pastor does, with their sermon or whatever. Like what?
Also with our titles and thumbnails.
Every once in a while, my dad would say a cuss word in the middle of a sermon, just to kind
Wake
of
them
show,
up a little bit.
Yeah, kind of show the thing. And from that point of view, the sin of empathy, and trying to figure out what a Christian is supposed to do, and trying to figure out the de-longhousification of Christianity, and what is a chivalric.
And he said that, and it was like the de-longhousification of Christianity, and I didn't know anything about that. And today in the live stream, Cale mentioned this Ross Douthat's new podcast and this guest that he had on that I had no idea who he was, and this Longhouse thing. So let's go a little bit more, and then we'll go to Douthat's with this guy.
Conquering manly Christianity about, and trying to find where's the strength, but also the temperance in that strength. Because it's necessary in order for young men to be drawn back into the church. There needs to be a return of the hero. And I think that, if we lean too hard on critiquing the feminization or the effeminate aspects, like empathy would be like the toxic feminine, you're like, well, we still have to invite and find where the woman belongs in this conservative or right-wing movement. That's why I like to ask all these right-wing guys, well, what's your message to women? Because they're not going to give up their rights and their property for you, even if they are miserable with a cat and SSRIs. They're not going to do that, man, and that, there has to be a container for empathy or sympathy, or that feminine ability to be really sensitive.
And that touched on the live stream that we did today about sort of the tension between what Rod Hare is often putting forward and what Mark Parker had talked about, and She's the Hill That You Die On, and the question of formation and what kind of man women want, what is a good man, and that, of course, that gets into the whole manosphere thing. So I was listening to this podcast, and let's see if I can find the spot. Now, part of what caught my attention with Douthat's conversation here was he made the point that the counterculture is now right wing. All right, now I've got real questions with this whole right and left thing, because I see it so swirled up. And you might say conservative or progressive. Okay, well, what does that mean? Because we're going to very much get into the question of what on earth does conservative mean. But Douthat, he is so sharp. I really enjoyed Douthat. He notes that this is a counterculture, which, of course, when I think counterculture, I'm old enough to think of the 60s and new music and protests against the Vietnam War and this massive movement that sort of transforms culture in the United States and culture in the West. I'm really looking forward to Tom Holland's book that he's working on this. And so before we get to the Longhouse thing, let's talk about art, because I thought I started listening to this. I got about 10 minutes in. It's like, I don't know who this guy is. I don't know what his publications are. I don't know half of these people that they're talking about. But then when they started and when Douthit said, well, this is a right-wing counterculture, I thought, huh, well, that's true. Because if you sort of look at, let me back this up a little bit. So the way sort of the counterculture thing worked, which was a remnant of the baby boomer era, was that in the 60s and 70s, young people are standing up to the man. They're growing their hair long. They're going to fight the system. They're going to bring about a better world. I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. I'd like to buy the world a Coke and keep it company. There it is. And of course, Mad Men ends there. And when I had my conversation with Local Distance, he talked about the rebel cell and how that sort of got completely embedded in the culture to the point that, of course, everything is a revolution. Jonathan Peugeot, of course, pushed back on rebel wisdom and said, if you do that, there's always a reactivity. It's parasitic. I think one of Jonathan Peugeot's great early videos was about parasitic culture. And so I grew up, I remember somewhat of the 60s. I started kindergarten in 68. I very clearly remember the 70s. In many ways, my father's little Christian Reformed church was a church where Christian Reformed youth who weren't ready to sort of go all the way, but wanted to sort of stay in the Christian Reformed church could go. And so we had African Americans, we're a racial reconciliation church. We had kids that were sort of on the verge of the counterculture. It was, thinking back on it, there was a bit of hippie-ishness to the church I grew up in and the milieu I grew up in. Of course, I was a child there, but it was also, my parents were deeply Christian people, it was no commune. It was nothing like that. I grew up in a very Christian, ordered Christian life. We went to church twice on Sunday. I went to Christian school. And so, we weren't radical in that sense, but we were sort of like, sort of moderate progressive and working towards women and incorporating women's ministries in churches' gifts, blah, 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 blah. And so you sort of set this path that there's a progressive edge. The main Christian Reformed church is conservative, but there's like this progressive edge. And that's the way to understand really the sort of entire arc of the baby boomers, and in many ways they're dutiful children who sort of continued the revolution. And I think of Kristen Kobes de May, even though her father is more conservative than she is, which is probably sort of what sets her up. And so she's going to come to Calvin and she'll be a shining star in the history department. And she'll be the first Calvin professor to write a New York Times bestseller, Jesus and John Wayne. But that so exemplifies, it's almost like the church takes history and slows it down. And she then becomes the counterculture. And there's still enough, as would demonstrate, because many in the counterculture would sort of deconstruct and leave Christianity in the emergent movement. So that what happens is that in many ways, let's say the new confessionalists in the Christian Reformed Church that turned the tide and stopped same-sex marriage, they're now the counterculture. And that's so amazingly disorienting for boomers. It's amazingly disorienting because, of course, their image of the world and the worldview was set. This is right there. It was set. And so to be a thinking person, you're, especially in something like the Christian Reformed Church, you're just, you're not going to go all the way to these other things, but just like I'd hear in, Canon Press and those people, no enemy to the right. Well, in some ways, for a lot of these progressives in the Christian Reformed Church, there's no enemies to the left. And, yeah, you're not going to go way over there. You've got questions. You don't really think that stuff's going to last too long. It's going to sort of burn out, but sort of you're stable, stay 20 years behind the cutting edge of history. You'll be fine. And the Christian Reformed Church is going to embrace same-sex marriage, and the Christian Reformed Church is going to just continue to sort of follow the main line 20 years later, except, of course, people see the main line kind of falling off a cliff, and people in the Christian Reformed Church are like, we're following them? We don't seem to be knocking on the door of the eschaton there. We seem to be sort of falling off the cliff. And, even in the 80s, so I go to college in the 80s, and the preppy thing is taking hold. And so, the Xers, the late boomers, and the early Xers, you see, of course, with punk and with preppy, there's sort of and with Ronald Reagan, there's sort of a little resistance to that counterculture. And it almost seems like now there's a big swing back, and the right is now the counterculture. And just like in the 60s, people were disgusted that kids weren't cutting their hair, and they're going to the Summer of Love, and they're doing weed, and the parents are just horrified, and they're disowning them, and yada yada yada. And eventually, sort of the culture catches up. Okay, and now, of course, the boomers are horrified. They're just horrified at this new counterculture. And maybe before we get here, I should go to this was an incredible conversation. This really was a very interesting conversation.
Trump, who I feel like don't quite grasp why he's successful and how, what you need to do in response, because I don't think he could be this successful if, if it were enough to just elect Joe Biden to fix our problems.
Well, clearly
right?
that didn't
work. Right, it didn't work.
We tried that, and definitely trying to elect him twice to fix our problems was not the winning move. I was listening a couple months ago to Barry Weiss's podcast, and she had Louise Perry, who's a sort of British conservative gender and sexuality writer.
It's and because if you look at Louise Perry, she's conservative. What on earth does that mean? Because, of course, if you look at her trajectory, her conservatism is countercultural because she was completely educated in the establishment and completely bought the feminist thing. And she got a little ways down the road and says, this isn't working. But yeah, okay, now she's a conservative.
And Perry made this argument that I've been thinking about, where she said that the difference between Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate is that Peterson is a Christian and Tate is a pagan. And I think this might be unfair to historic pagans, but the argument she was making depends on the pagans, but also depends on the Christians. So
now let's. So in Counterculture 1.0, paganism was made cool again. Eastern religions came in, Native American spiritualities, there's a lot of fascination about them. I mean, if you want to be part of that counterculture, you decide you're going to be a druid and you're going to dance in the woods, or you're going to be a Satanist, or you're going to get into Wiccan. And so, even in, let's say, Paul Kingsnorth's trajectory, that's countercultural. Now, notice that there's a pagan element to this counterculture, too. And now, as in this conversation, maybe I'll play enough of it to get there. Someone was telling me how she wants to start a podcast and she wants to talk about Christian nationalism. She wants to denounce it. And I told her, I think you're a little late. Because you'll notice that nobody's setting their hair on fire yelling about Christian nationalism anymore. Not after Trump. Why? Because when Trump announced the tariffs and when Trump, basically said what he said to Canada, basically the whole left, their complaint that he wasn't sufficiently Christian. And it's like, hey, wait a minute. We just spent the last 6 months with you guys just screaming out, our year was you guys screaming out loud about these, taking things from Counterculture 1.0's playbook that you're trying to turn this into a theocracy. Well, who wants a theocracy now?
But the argument she was making is that Peterson is, at least in his ethics, somebody who thinks a lot about the weak, who cherishes women. Tate is more interested in power, in dominance, in sort of driving his enemies before him and sort of fathering a lot of children for a lot of people potentially. And I've thought,
okay, so, well, I'm going to play a little bit of this one too. Let's just, how shall we go here? All right, some of you are going to be triggered. Just hang on to yourselves here.
Freedom to do what they want to do. And that is the evisceration of all the values of civilization that conservatism is supposed to transmit and preserve. And I think the raw lust for power that Donald Trump embodies has not only eviscerated conservatism, it's eviscerated Christianity. Christianity is a system designed around the meek, service to the poor. Jesus never embraced worldly power. Donald Trump is completely about worldly power. It's about domination. And so it's been interesting to me to watch a political leader eviscerate the two philosophies that he claims to stand for, both conservatism and Christianity, and such is the acidic power of nihilism.
Okay, so now, there's just so much interesting in there. Jesus was not about worldly power. Ooh, you need to work on that phrase so much to say, what was Jesus about? You do talk about that a long time. But anyway, in civilization, and when he says civilization, I can't but stop thinking about, Augustine's City of God, the libido dominandi. That was let's see, the heart of the civilization of the Roman Empire. And so you're not going to say that the Romans weren't civilization, but of course it all depends on what your civilization is sort of centering around. And David Brooks's argument here is that basically Trump isn't conservative. And it's like, well, I'll agree with that. But when you get to the other guy that Douthit is talking about here, where you're talking about let's say the countercultural right wing, are they conservative? That video of Aaron McIntyre where he's talking to David Smith, they made the point, Cthulhu always swims left, that whole business. But David Smith then was also making the argument that, but take any conservative today, and this is a comment that's been made many times, drop them into the past, do they fit? And it's, part of what, once the main civilizational frame and all of its elements are sort of deconstructed, you can't really navigate these terms like conservative or progressive, because progressing towards what? Or conserving what? And so David Brooks's idea of conservative, well, you're conserving certain institutions, and this guy's basically going to say, no, you're conserving those institutions ought to go. Now let's keep going with Ezra Klein here.
Thought about that question, that sort of war between, again, sort of crude paganism and Christianity, as really playing out right now on the right and in the Trump administration. There are ways in which those strands seem braided through everything. The sort of drive for power, for sort of renewed 19th century masculinity versus the sort of more Christian dimensions of it. There's, in a way, like Vance as a emblem of the Christian side of the administration. Musk is an emblem of its pagan side with his many kids from many different women.
Yep.
Trump is somebody who, in his both traditionalism, like as a person, and also his brashness and will to power as a person, sort of has both threads inside himself at the same time.
Maybe. I think, honestly, I think Trump may have come to some conception of belief in God after the assassination attempt. Just sort of observing his comments a little bit, but
let's hold back a little bit now, because the way the table is sort of set, to be Christian is to be a pacifist. A lot of Christians haven't been pacifists. Remember, Christian has its lion phase, and Christianity has its fox phase. And now you might argue that Christianity is only fox or Christianity is only lion. I get it. But Christianity has played the full span of the keys. Now you might say when Christianity was playing the lion keys, it was sinning and betraying its Lord. And when Christianity was playing the fox keys, those are the keys it should stick to. I get it. Which is to say that there have been plenty of these are the tensions. It'd be so interesting if they do the book of Revelation, because these are the tensions in the New Testament. Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the earth on the cross. But he comes roaring back in the book of Revelation in the eschaton as a lion, against whom the people great and small of the earth call to the hills to fall on them, to save them from the face of the one on the throne and from the Lamb. And so Jesus is this lion-lamb figure. And so, Douthat, who is a very intelligent, very sophisticated Christian, you can almost watch him wrestle with these things.
I think of Trump as just sort of persistently as a kind of pagan or heathen figure, much more than he is a Christian figure, notwithstanding the attempts to sort of claim him as a kind of, King David or Emperor Constantine, right? Like there's sort of an idea that you get from religious conservative supporters of Trump that, you have these figures in the Bible or Christian history who are rulers, who are sinful in various ways, but maybe in a way like I've been describing, sort of advance God's cause despite their sins and failings. I don't really think of Trump that way, but he is committed in an explicit way to Christianity. And Trump, to me, the bargain with Trump has always been, for religious conservatives, some mix of protection and support, a transactional bargain, and then more recently, a kind of hope that some kind of renewal of American dynamism can sort of bring religion itself back with it, which I will say is a hope that I have indulged in myself, right? That it's like, okay, you have different varieties of post-Christianity out there, and you don't want to ally with the Andrew Tates, but you do want to ally with the people who have sort of, big hopes for the future, rather than a woke progressivism that just seems sort of inflected with cultural despair, right? That would be an argument that I think a Christian who, was trying to sort of explain to themselves how they find themselves in alliance with Elon Musk might say, right? Like better Elon who has some good desires and believes that humanity is good in some way and wants a sort of more dynamic future, better that than, pure pessimism, the climate change is going to kill us all and structural racism means we deserve it kind of perspective. That would be the argument.
Let me ask about the idea that what you just described, though, is pure pessimism. Putting aside the idea that climate change will kill us all, which I don't believe, I think most people, even on the left, don't believe. They believe there's a way out. You just have to really work for it.
Mm-hmm.
You give at the end of your book an account of why you're a Christian.
All right, before we go there, again, the mixture of Christian and paganism, one of the books that I was reading when I was on Holy Week, when I was out in the desert, it sounds so holy. I was at a really nice hotel in the desert. It wasn't monastic. Well, the power was out for a whole day. And so I lived with power for a day by the side of a pool, a spring-fed pool. It was lovely. New Romans. On 11 May 330, the sun rising behind the Asian hills across the Bosporus shone for the last time on the ancient city of Byzantium. On that day, the Emperor Constantine rededicated the city to himself and to the fortune of Rome. Henceforth, Byzantium became Constantinople, and, as New Rome, would change the course of history. While the city lay still in the pre-dawn shadow, the sun reflected off its highest point, a colossal statue of Constantine himself. It was gilded bronze nude, with rays emerging from his head, spear in his left hand, and a globe signifying universal dominion in his right. Standing atop a column of purple stone that was almost 40 meters tall and banded with victory laurel wreaths, the Colossus was a repurposed Apollo. It reinforced the emperor's long association with the solar god and the first emperor of Rome. Over 3 centuries before, Augustus had chosen Apollo to project the serene power, eternal youth, and classical order of his new golden age. Constantine's statue alluded also to the Colossus of Sol that stood beside the Colosseum in Rome and gave it its name. And it linked New Rome, or nearby Troy, the ancient Roman homeland whose patron deity was Apollo. Constantine and his city thus picked up the thread of an old history. The Romans, this is civilization, it's pagan civilization. Constantine, he's in process of, there's a transformation. Stories still circulated that Constantine had brought his column from Troy and had intended to found his new city there, but was diverted by an apparition to the more advantageous location of Byzantium. Touched by the dawn, the gilded statue blazed over the citizens like the sun. It illuminated the form of Constantine, in whose center it stood, a circular paved plaza. The forum was enclosed by a 2-tiered colonnade of white marble and was bisected by the city's main boulevard. Now, a little bit later, this pillar stands today. You can still see it. Now, Apollo's gone. Eventually, they put a cross up there, which, okay. But there it is.
Based on a kind of shared understanding at the highest level of abstraction, cultivate with this. But
I got to check and say I had a little button there. I got to make sure I got what I got. Okay, also having some little technical problems. Let's see if this works.
So the idea is that the future is discovered. Okay, we're not going to be able to predict ahead of time what this new sort of culture will look like. It is throwing these ingredients out there based on a kind of shared understanding at the highest level of abstraction, some kind of alignment that, at least for now, is defined in opposition of both the left, okay, and like wokeness, which is easy, but it's also defined in some sense in opposition to the conservatism that has come before. Not because it's antagonistic towards that kind of conservatism per se, but that kind of conservatism is limited in what it can produce creatively.
Right.
And so, and this is a lot of the frustration that people have had with the right is anytime anyone on the conservative side goes to make some kind of art or do culture, it's just bad. And the left is right about this. There's been, at least for my lifetime, this critique that the right can't do art, that the right can't do culture.
So why is that? What is right-wing art missing, that the right-wing counterculture is trying to supply? What are the ingredients?
It's not historically true, but at least
right. In the last 30, 40 years,
okay.
Let's say.
So I think partly it's fear of the unknown.
And again, this is so interesting because the counterculture did a ton of art. Popular music in America was remade. If you watch the Bob Dylan movie, you could just watch the page turn. And it's a hagiography now for Americans, for boomers to watch that. And so that was a transformation in art that then seeped into the culture. And now he's saying, for the last episode, the right, whatever that means, has struggled with art.
It's a lack of tolerance for artistic license and the messiness and chaos of what is entailed by the creative process. And, it's just the case that if you are going to embark on a new cultural project, you have to have some amount of...
I guess I don't know the backstory. I heard a little bit of it in the write-up, but, again, looking at what this guy's wearing, he's wearing an Oxford shirt. And when I was in college, for example, I mean, this was sort of what you wore in the early 80s at Calvin College in Michigan. You wore a nice sweater, you wore an Oxford, it was buttoned. I mean, we laugh about our denim wars, but underneath these denim wars, something's swimming.
Of taste for offense. And, okay, I'll say this. There's probably three aspects to why conservative art is bad or has been bad. And this is reductive, of course, but this might help sort of frame things. It's moralistic. Okay, it's much too moralistic. It's didactic. It's always trying to tell you a self-consciously conservative message. It's overly sentimental. And then there's also this nostalgia.
Now, what he just said there is exactly the complaint about Christian movies so often. And it's really interesting how, let's say, The Chosen sort of broke new ground, because now suddenly, for some groups of people, The Chosen is a little countercultural. And, House of David, at least I think on some parts, perhaps they wanted House of David to be a little bit more countercultural. But again, you can just see things moving under the surface here.
Thing. It's always looking backwards. And conservative art is always looking to the past because it's familiar. It's something that's already been established. It's something for which they already know what they're supposed to like, what's good and what's not good. So there's no risk in trying anything new. And then the third thing I'll say here is that it's grievance oriented. And this comes in two forms. It's either we're owning the libs, or here's a story about all of the ways the libs are making our lives unbearable.
Well,
Now, what's so interesting here is that the rise of grievance culture, and maybe, I don't know, maybe once you succumb to a certain level of grievance, you lose the attractional cultural edge. Because the truth is that sort of the spirit of grievance and bitterness, it's unbecoming. People don't like hanging around people with grievances unless they share in the communion of that grievance. And of course, grievance culture became a big piece of woke culture. So, super interesting.
I want to make this just a tiny bit more concrete and say, from any period, not the last 20 years, any period in American life, modern Western history, give me an example of something you consider successful right-wing art that doesn't fall into the traps you've described.
Sure. No Country for Old Men is an example, but it's not self-consciously.
Now, part of what's been interesting is that meme culture has sort of developed on the right. And going back to a Jordan Hall conversation where when we saw the transition going from sort of mass media culture of television, where there are certain liturgies and practices, into social media culture, and Jordan Hall said, when I saw that, I knew there was going to, politically it was going to flip, because the Democratic Party was the party of mass media. And of course, Roosevelt was a pioneer of mass media radio. And then John F. Kennedy getting makeup, and Nixon wins on the radio, but Kennedy wins on TV. And so that sort of the Roosevelt to Obama Obama, of course, was starting to make the transition. He was a lot slicker than some of the other recent Democratic. And the fact that, again, Kamala Harris doesn't go on Rogan. Trump's very at home in social media culture and very at home with memes.
Right wing.
Right.
I
Right. No,
doubt,
absolutely.
the Coen brothers would call themselves on the right, and I don't even know if Cormac McCarthy would, who wrote the book it's based on. But to my mind, it is precisely right wing art. Or, David Lynch. Pretty much everything David Lynch touches, I think, has a certain kind of a right wing coding to it. Certainly, his
So
major works.
So what is the coding? What makes, to a listener for whom it seems absurd to call No Country for Old Men right wing, what makes that right wing to you?
Okay. Because I like it. It's good, and therefore I want it to share my sort of political preferences. But beyond that,
Hey, an honest guy.
And this is where there would be some points of disagreement. Oh, by the way, it also calls something like Girls, the TV show Girls, is a right-wing show.
Yeah, well, that now you're just pandering to me, because that was my
have you written about
consistent view. Yes, okay. This is a hobby horse of mine. Yes.
All right. So then we might share the premise here that what constitutes quote unquote right-wing art, which is, by the way, some labeling we're grafting onto this thing after the fact, and so it's actually like a very flimsy kind of labeling. But what these pieces of work are doing is telling the truth about the world in a way that is not compromised by artistic or ideological preferences about how these events and these characters and these people, what society wishes were true.
That's too easy. Because art is far deeper. It's sort of like saying, if the ideology of the art isn't fully integrated and is somehow visible like a shiny veneer that distracts from seeing what's underneath it, but all art, good art, has it embedded sufficiently in it to the degree that you don't notice it. It just looks like it's supposed to look.
True about these people. So my thing is that if you are telling the truth about the world, then you are going to make right-wing art.
But isn't that then a little circular? Then you're saying all great art is somehow right-wing. Like, to me, for instance, I feel like, a TV show that I've enjoyed is Andor. It's one of the few Star Wars shows that I've enjoyed. I see that as kind of left-wing art. It's a show that uses the background of, the Empire and the Star Wars universe to tell a story about sort of, punishing militaristic tyranny and resistance to it in ways that are sort of left-coded, but also it's a really good show. Whereas I would look at Girls and say, look, in the end, it's a scabrous satire of a particular kind of upper middle class, lifestyle in a liberal city, and so it is coming from a right wing perspective. I feel like, can there be? So, do you think can there be great left wing art from your perspective?
I suppose, yeah, but I'll say this: like, I think it depends. I understand your point that it's highly reductive to just simply say if I like it, therefore it's right wing art, or if it tells the truth,
it tells the truth
right wing
is
art.
what you're saying.
But
same for experts.
Okay, so what I mean by that, though, as a point of clarification, is there are certain, at least modern left-wing premises that support their worldview and their political agenda that I think are belied by someone telling the truth about the world. And here's an example of this. The left sort of takes as a foundational principle of its politics the idea of equality, that there's a kind of flattening of people, and that through carefully managed social engineering, we can produce a society that either levels out any kind of natural hierarchy or produce a system that somehow can wrangle these natural, almost supernatural sort of entropic forces that, are constantly creating chaos and constantly requiring our maintenance and management and authority to deal with.
Okay, good. That's what I was looking for.
Yes.
So this takes us into one of the phrases that I think gets used to describe what the counterculture is up to. And I know you're ambivalent about this phrase, but it's the idea that gets called vitalism, right? Which is this term that means, let's say, a celebration of individuality, strength, excellence, and an anxiety about equality and democracy as, just the way you described, as leveling forces, enemies of human greatness. And it gets connected to Friedrich Nietzsche.
Okay. And again, if you go back to the David Brooks thing, it's exactly his complaint about Trump. And so then you get this coding of, we talked about this in the live stream today, of masculinity is hierarchical, femininity is egalitarian. So you have the tension between the two.
Sure. I think there's a Ayn Rand who's, a very popular novelist on the American right. Whatever you make of her actual books is in some sense in the...
And again, the paganism, because you've got heroes who, the heroic pagan. Why would Constantine identify with Apollo?
This school. But that to me seems like one common thread including in the books that you yourself have published. Like, what links the white Russian general standing athwart the Bolsheviks to the Hardy Boys, to Conan the Barbarian? It is some kind of idea of human greatness beset by mediocrity and so on. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I wouldn't contest that basic summary. I don't want to overdo like how we're thinking about this word vitality. For the purposes of this conversation, it's enough to say it's something like, a thymos, okay, spiritedness, a self-will, aliveness, or and also I want to say that there's a certain kind of eroticism to vitality that's very important and has often been missing from sort of the conservative view of the world. And that, I think that's a mistake. I think you're leaving something very important on the table by not grappling with this notion of eroticism and what that means and why it might be valuable, especially...
Now, of course, there's masculine and feminism, masculine and feminine eroticism. Masculine eroticism is take. Feminine eroticism is seduce. And I've often said that, a woman can own a room of strong men. A man might be able to overpower one man, but two men can overpower one. But a woman can overpower the room. And this is where, again, talking about hierarchy and masculine and feminine, women are in many ways team egalitarian until there's an imbalance. You have a room full of men and women together, and an extraordinarily beautiful woman walks in the room and eyes turn. And suddenly we're at the meme of, the dude, and he's looking at the girl up there, and the girlfriend is looking at him in sheer and utter disgust. And so, these basic things are at play here beneath the surface.
And here's the premise we're starting from, and I think, Ross, we share this view that we're reaching this phase, whether it's cyclical or there's sort of this longer term linear path of kind of civilizational exhaustion, decay, decadence. That's a word I know you've used a lot. And this all requires rebirth. And the process of rebirth is not gentle. It can be violent and difficult. So I would say that vitality serves these two basic functions right now, and why it's valuable for us to take on board. One, it attracts young people. Young people, I think men in particular, women too, though, are naturally attracted to this sort of notion of vitality. They see it, they know it, and they want to be around it. The right has failed for a long time to attract young people. This is finally changing over the last few years. It's also a way of overcoming a kind of defeatism of this sort of idea that things are past the point of saving, that we can't do anything, that all there is left for us in, the 21st century is to, on the one hand, merely manage playing out this end of history period. This sense of vitality, I think, offers something else. It offers the human subject the opportunity to advance positively and affirmatively into the future. So that's my defense of vitalism.
Right. And it's an escape from, and now I'm going to move to a second term that you yourself have used, right?
Yes.
It's an escape from what gets called the Longhouse, right? And you mentioned, sort of men and women as sort of each vital in certain ways, but the Longhouse is a specifically feminine-coded narrative of like what's wrong with contemporary life. So what is the Longhouse?
Okay, so I wrote this essay called "What is the Longhouse" for First Things Magazine.
So you can answer the question. Yes.
I would encourage anybody who wants to know the precise details to go read that article, because I spell out what I mean by it. And here I'm going to talk in sort of maybe more vague terms, but it's essentially an explanation and exploration of what I perceive as a kind of over-feminization of society. And I don't mean that as it's explicitly women who are taking over society, because often the Longhouse is managed by men, and in some cases it's better managed by men or more sort of severely and strictly managed by men. But it is a kind of feminine way of social management that is distinct from a kind of male or masculine coded social management and group dynamics. There's a certain, it's maybe a phrase is like a regime of maternal surveillance is a phrase I've used before, that preferences, for example, inclusion, conflict avoidance, consensus, safety, and these kinds of priorities supersede things like truth finding and competition and the kinds of violent, often, and I don't mean necessarily physically violent, but it can be that, but a kind of combativeness that better characterizes a kind of masculine way of thinking about ideas. And again, why this gets back to certain other things we've talked about is the Longhouse is essentially flattening. It's horizontal, whereas a masculine way of doing things in this model is hierarchical. It's vertical. And what a more combative style of discourse, for example, does is help establish those hierarchies and where the value of ideas are relative to one another. The Longhouse doesn't allow for that because it's more interested in making sure everybody's feelings are maintained and nobody's offended.
And just so listeners are clear, this is a reference to, there's a kind of, I'm going to call it a pseudo anthropology because I don't think you're actually making specific claims about the human past, but there's a contrast between sort of Longhouse culture of a literal longhouse of a tribe sort of crowded together under one roof with what? The freedom of the steppe barbarian?
Yeah, I mean, so this comes from Bronze Age Pervert, okay? Bronze Age Mindset, which is one of the great texts of the 21st century, and I encourage all the New York Times listeners to read it. It's very important if you actually want to understand this stuff.
I agree.
So he talks about the Longhouse, and he's got his own take on it. I borrowed the term, and actually why I think the term is so valuable is because it is a kind of empty signifier. I don't mean to tie it to this sort of historical context. It's an evocative image. It's this big, long, literal house that we're all stuck inside of, and you're constrained in how you can behave, how you can act, and I think it's hostile towards men in particular having a kind of freedom of assembly with one another.
So concrete examples would be the crusade against Greek life at universities, right? You would see as Longhouse in action.
And,
corporate HR departments and sensitivity trainings, Longhouse in action, right?
Well, and you can probably the most sort of salient example of this, precisely because it's where you would at least expect this kind of Longhouse cultural framing to take root, is the military. And actually, Pete Hegseth has talked about this explicitly, is this integration of women into the military. We don't need to get into the politics of that. Suffice to say, though, that these traditionally male spaces, sort of our martial culture, has been now, it's open to women. And this introduced...
Okay, now Douthit's going to, again, the different conservatism, Douthit's going to push back on that and say, well, maybe I can just jump forward.
Now a more personal objection rooted in my own religious commitments, which is that, as you say, I have a lot of sympathy for the broad view that late modern life has become decadent, and some kind of sense of possibility, some kind of sense of action, some kind of sense of human capacity is really important to getting us either out of this trench or through whatever weird bottleneck digital life and AI are going to create. I agree with all of that. However, I'm also a Christian, right? And all of the authors that I've mentioned who are part of the vitalist tradition, Nietzsche, Rand, Bronze Age pervert, see themselves operating in opposition to Christianity. They see Christianity as fundamentally, it's either, it's a religion of the weak, it's a religion of women, perhaps, it's, it's against the erotic, right? And so when I look at the right-wing counterculture right now, I see a force that has sort of there are people who are, really into traditionalist Catholicism and whatnot there. But there's also a lot of people who, I think, in their own story about what went wrong with the right, the normie right, the boring right of Kevin McCarthy, sort of think at some level, it was a bunch of weak, thin milk drinking Christians who didn't understand that, what is actually best in life is to crush your enemies, to see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentations of their women, right?
Sure.
So I'm curious, what is your attitude towards those debates? What's your attitude towards Christianity and religion?
Yeah, I mean, my belief is that there's actual tremendous amount of synchronicity between these two sort of modes of...
Funny choice of words.
...operating in the world. And it's not just my belief, my favorite author and actually...
All right. So it's interesting because, of course, so many different voices coming in before Trump. Oh, Christians, Christian nationalism. We've got to keep the Christians away. We want a secular state. We want secularity. Christians, stay in your corner. Christians elected Trump, all of that stuff. And then the world just sort of turns and we can go to the other side and hit.
And why you're a Catholic and why you find it persuasive. And I find your account of it very moving. It's a thing that appeals to me about Christianity. And the account you give is about both the strangeness and the radicalism of Jesus Christ as a figure. How uncomfortable it is to read him, how challenging, how it's a religion about meekness. All of the rich man has a better chance of, the camel's a better chance of fitting through the eye of the needle than the rich man of getting into heaven. That there's always been a radicalism in that. And
I know the meek will inherit the earth is a famous line. I would say renunciation more than meekness, probably.
But there's a godliness of those who do not have power.
Yes.
And at the same time, then, there is this administration, I think, is very self-consciously...
See, what's so interesting is that... Well, let me pull that up. I loved Glenn's video on ARC 2025 because he so articulated something
An environmentalist met much stronger opposition when the vibe was in that direction. Now, I fundamentally believe you do not have equal rights for male and female without Christianity. I've written a whole book about it. It's called The Air We Breathe, and how equality and compassion and many other of our values have come from the Jesus Revolution. I also think you don't get proper environmental concern without the Jesus Revolution. We can get into that. But the vibe shift meant that such left-coded evangelism, which was very well-meaning, fell on a lot of deaf ears. And the more recent vibe shift means that the kind of evangelism that I think resonates today would be, let's get Louise Perry to talk about, yes, Christianity and feminism, but also gender and identity and sex and the sexual revolution. And she has gone on a journey from left, and I guess most people would identify her on the right, writing for the Telegraph and the Daily Mail and people like that. But she gives a robust critique of the sexual revolution. And
no, this wasn't exactly where I wanted
approach
it.
to the Bible, and at points that means that his theology is 180 degrees.
I gotta find it.
And maybe some of the guys that I've been calling the good guys are in fact the bad guys, and perhaps I've been captive to one kind of vibe, and I need to investigate my beliefs more deeply. And this is why, as an evangelist, I see the audience for ARC being an incredible mission field. I was there for 3 days. I went with 3 evangelistic books of mine to give away to people, and I got rid of those before lunch on day 1, having one conversation after another. So whenever I talk to somebody, I would just say, what's it like being surrounded by so many Christians? Because there are just Christians everywhere. The great majority of those on stage are Christian, whether they declare that or not. And I would say the great majority of those who are in attendance are Christians of one stripe or another. And so if it turned out that somebody wasn't, I was like, what's it like being surrounded by all these Christians? And then I would explain, I am one, by the way, just before you say anything too horrible about Christians. And we would get into deep, rich conversations about, you know what, I started reading Job. That's what one guy, he wasn't even a Christian, and yet on his business card, he was a writer, on his business card, he had Proverbs written, like he had a proverb. Like with the Bible reference underneath it, as he gave it to me, and he's been like really deeply impacted by Jordan.
Okay, I think I got it now.
Jesus, the next person, a very deep conversation about Jesus. I was done with all this, but I've now got to go and post. I've got to go and post another couple of books to people afterwards. I just didn't bring enough evangelistic literature with me, which means next ARC, I wonder if, I don't know if I'll pay for a ticket, but I might pay for a stand and go into the exhibition hall. And I think what I'll have is just a massive sign, and it'll just say, stop talking about biblical values and read the darn thing. And I'll just hand out Bibles to people. I think that might be incredibly fruitful. And like, how does that strike you, if you're a Christian, how does that strike you that there is an incredibly fruitful mission field on the right of things? Because I'm one of the good people. I've always been one of the good people. I went to the right college at the right university with impeccable kind of liberal credentials. And I've always been used to being that kind of person. And I do evangelism sometimes on university campuses in which generally, through the 2000s and the 2010s, the tactic has always been to say, Jesus is also an environmentalist, so become a Christian. Jesus is also a feminist.
And this is classic Tim Keller. Tim Keller worked this like no one had ever seen.
So become a Christian. And a lot of apologetics has always been left-coded while I've been an evangelist. I guess I've worked full-time for churches for the last 25 years, and officially as an evangelist, with evangelist on my business card since 2010. So I've done a lot of this stuff, and a lot of it is left-coded, which is great. I mean, that's where I'm from, and that's kind of the political home that I've always
felt most at home in, and I guess anyone who is my age has always swum in those sorts of waters. And now there's a vibe shift happening, and this current vibe shift is very much a reaction to the previous vibe shift, because I would say that ever since gay marriage came in on either side of the Atlantic, from that moment onwards, I think there's been a sense of you're on the right side of history if you take these social and cultural views. And in that setting, the apologetics talk, Jesus is also a feminist, just met much stronger opposition. Jesus is also an environmentalist, met much stronger opposition when the vibe was in that direction. Now, I fundamentally believe you do not have equal rights for male and female without Christianity. I've written a whole book about it. It's called The Air We Breathe, and how equality and compassion and...
All right. Tim Keller, Glenn Scrivener, with evangelist written on his card. Your pitch was left-coded. This vibe shift, it's all the way around. And what's so ironic is that that left-coded pitch was exactly intended to hit someone like Ezra Klein. And again, I think about Ryan Bell. So Ryan Bell, back during the emergent days, he was an Seventh-day Adventist preacher, and there was like a year of living Christian, so he decided to do a year of living atheist. And to the surprise of nobody, the year became forever. And I remember reading, I could dig it up on my blog, I know I could, but I remember reading how he was talking about the fact that, why be a Christian? Because the forefront is not with the Christians. The Christians are like Kristen Kobes Dumais. They're just 10 years behind. And they're just kind of keeping an eye on the main line. And the Christian Reformed Church is watching the main line. And it's like the main line are the scouts, and the Christian Reformed people are a little ways back. And it's like, well, we'll just keep following you just 10 or 20 years late, okay? We've got all these other conservatives we need to evangelize with our liberationism, and as they increasingly become liberated, then we're going to tend to them behind, but we'll keep following along. And then whoosh, the whole thing switches, and the counterculture is right wing. And it used to be cool to be a pagan on the left wing, and now people like Ezra Klein are looking at the right-wing pagans, and it was Douthit that said, if you don't like the Christian right, wait till you see the post-Christian right. You ain't gonna like them at all. And you're gonna say, please serve me up a bowl of that Christian nationalism. We want it more. I want a president who's gonna brag about being a Christian, because bring back all of that mid-century modern mainline implicit Christian ethic that founded the United Nations and kept the world order stable, and yada, yada, yada. And so there's this amazing moment where, Ezra Klein, and he's not the only one. I mean, I can pull up plenty of videos of, what's that guy, Jonathan Rauch, who wrote this book, and I've talked about his book before. He was on with Barry Weiss on the Free Press. I haven't watched that video, but I know what he's going to say, because I've heard him, he's on his book tour, and he just keeps talking about what's in his book. And I just read the Amazon sample of his book, and it was, I want Christians to be more Christian. And it's like, wait a minute, you were complaining about dread Christian nationalism just a few months ago, and now it's like, no, please, give me more of that Christian nationalism.
So a big part of your book, as I read it, is about what happens when elite society becomes hostile in its view of the world to the human impulse to seek a picture of reality that runs deeper than materialism. What happens when the seekers have nowhere to go, when organized religion weakens, or not nowhere to go? What happens when they're not channeled into organized religion? And what happens when elite society becomes too materialistic? And I understand for you, and you can tell me if this is wrong, that one of the...
And, because in the last phase, it's like, first it was like, well, religion, organized religion is for the muscle, is for the knuckle draggers, the people that cling to their Bibles and guns, as Obama said. And, maybe there's a nice form of religion in those mainline churches, but we don't go to them because, like Ryan Bell, I want to be on the vanguard, so I'm going to go to the university and I'm going to burn something that, that makes a point, or I'm going to protest, or I'm going to do all these things. And then, of course, we had this whole wave of people ought to stop going to church. And now, you've got new atheists that are like, we just kind of need Christian herd immunity that will be sufficient to hold liberalism at this 1999 point before we sort of drift off into the chaos.
The forces I think that you believe is driving the era is a kind of frustrated seeking, a sort of desire to re-enchant the world, like that has run into an elite culture, maybe its apex being the Obama administration and that sort of moment in American life.
It's the Ezra Klein show.
It's the
apex. Ezra, let's be honest here.
Although we'll get into this. I always joke the difference between you and me is more that you're a Catholic and I'm a Californian than that I'm a materialist and you're not. Because
one can use the word materialist in different ways.
Sure.
Too.
When you use it in this context, what do you mean?
I mean the view that all of existence, life, the universe, and everything is finally reducible to matter in motion. That matter is primary and mind is secondary rather than the other way around. I don't mean materialism in terms of, Madonna's Material Girl or something like that, although the two can be connected. So one of the various arguments in my book, right, is that disenchantment is fake, fundamentally, right? The idea that you can enter a secular age where once upon a time people had wild religious experiences, but now we inhabit the iron cage of modernity and all of those are off the table. That just doesn't describe reality. Mystical experience, religious experience, it's not just the impulse. Like, I think secular liberals are very comfortable saying, oh, well, there's always a religious impulse, but it's more than that. It's that people have encounters with God, whatever God may be, some kind of higher reality that enters them and transforms them and gives them visions and gives them intense experiences, or maybe they have them on the verge of death and come back to tell about them. Well, this is just a feature of human life. It's a very profound and important feature of human life. Maybe it can be explained in non-religious terms. Maybe there's some reductive explanation, but there isn't a good one on offer right now. And so the persistence of that means that religion always regenerates itself, because even under conditions where almost nobody is committed to a particular church or creed, people are going to go on having, dramatic encounters, right? Like someone like, Barbara Ehrenreich, who's...
Now, this is really important because, Klein is a Californian, and a little bit later in this, going to get into his ayahuasca experience and get into his vision about, now he's a secular Jew, but into his Judaism, and so he basically validates Douthat's point here. And at this point then in the conversation, it's a little bit earlier, Klein basically makes the point that, gosh, the Roush point, I really wish Christians would, curb Donald Trump a little bit. I really wish Donald Trump would be more Christian. And, of course, the kind of Christian that they want, because, again, that's the formation, that's the formation of the moral imagination that Christianity built in, and then they woke up and they lost the footnotes, but they said, yeah, that's just true.
Not atypical, I guess. But then the second point that I want to push you on is what kind of argument is this that you think you're going to win with religious believers who disagree with you? You're like, well, I don't believe in your religion, but I really wish that you would follow your religion so that your politics were more aligned with mine. That's just not much of an argument at all. And I think to the extent that all of liberalism, the ideology that you subscribe to, trades on inherited ideas from Christianity about morality and equality and so on, while you've jettisoned the portrait of the universe, the metaphysical structure that gives them meaning, I think it's really hard from that point of view for you to get anywhere in arguments with people who still believe in that structure, because you're essentially saying, I've stripped away the conceptual framework that makes your moral ideas make sense, but now I'm going to complain that you're not living up to your moral ideas. I just think that's a really weak argument.
Oh, but I'm not arguing it.
Well, you're saying it to me. I'm right here. I'm a Christian. I'm right here. You're arguing. You're expressing sorrowful disappointment that Christians are not living up to a worldview that you think is false.
Well, I think parts of it are. Well, I am unconvinced on parts of it. We'll talk about the view of the cosmos in a minute. And I'm not trying to offend you here. I'm actually asking.
I'm not. What, Ezra, does anything about our long relationship suggest that you could possibly offend me?
I've known you long enough to know when you're getting a bit heated.
That's totally different. Heatedness, I mean, as I was saying, the New Testament is filled with heated encounters.
I don't think a thing I'm saying here is going to convince somebody on the Christian right to turn around their view of Donald Trump. I am genuinely curious how somebody of your politics and your religious background interprets somebody like J.D. Vance. So I'm asking you questions about it.
Christianity does not provide some kind of incredibly strong bulwark against powerful people doing the kinds of things that powerful people do, which means, self-interested conquest of various kinds and so on, right? What it does provide is an ongoing internal critique that those powerful people have to wrestle with and address in ways that are fairly...
If they are a Christian, if they believe it. And this is sort of where many of the kinds of powerful people he's talking about in their youth, in their vitalism, went and conquered Americas and made war and all of that, or Carnegie in his youth, voraciously being a tycoon, a Gilded Age tycoon, and then later on thinking about, Judgment Day, maybe I better build some libraries. Maybe I better give my money away. And in fact, this dynamic that then gilded the monasteries of the medieval world, which then, of course, in the early modern period, the also Christian monarchs raided, and the French Revolution, took all that land and money because it was the guilt of past ages and the concern for their eternal destiny that fueled all of this stuff. So it's a great speech Douthit gave.
Unique in the historical relationship of power and piety. So if you look at something like, to take the most famous example, maybe the Spanish conquest of the Americas, right? In terms of what is actually done in the course of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, you can find, plenty of terrible crimes that you, Ezra Klein, would say, well, what good is your religion if it licenses, if your civilization commits these kind of crimes? But from the very beginning, in Spain itself, in the heart of super Catholic, Counter-Reformation era Spain, there's an ongoing and agonizing and, sometimes intensely legal and practical, sometimes high-level philosophical, theological debate that subjects the behavior of the Spanish conquistadors and others to this kind of sustained critique and leads to, at various times, sometimes successful, mostly unsuccessful, reform efforts driven by the Catholic monarchy of Spain, and ultimately builds out and influences everything from the anti-slavery movement in the 18th and 19th century that's ultimately successful down to contemporary ideas about human rights and international law that, again, today's secular liberals take for granted as a kind of scripture. All of that emerges out of the efforts of serious Christians in a context of profound historical temptation and constant sinfulness to sort of generate from within the resources of their religion. And I think, if you take the Trump administration, for instance, it's not as though, you cannot find Christian critiques of Trump administration cruelty. They just are not, at the moment, the primary thing. I would expect, we'll find out, right? We're 3 months into a kind of shock and awe administration. I think that, and people have been sort of baffled and surprised by some of the turns that things have taken. But certainly people I take seriously within conservative Christianity have spoken out against things like, the cuts to humanitarian aid or anything like that. But again, I completely agree with you that history supplies constant tests of what your religion is for. and there's no end until the end, right, to the testing. And sometimes you succeed. More often you fail, but hopefully you do something that has good effects down the road. And sometimes you fail entirely, and then maybe God sifts you and finds you wanting. I'm not kidding here, right? That this is actually like, it is important to see every moment as a potential moral test that you might well be failing. I'm a conservative Christian. You could say I'm a member of the Christian right for your purposes, right? As Christianity has weakened in American life, a really hard question has become like, who is the most dangerous of your different enemies? Or, like, who is most threatening to the Christian view of the good society, right? Is it, a woke progressivism that wants to, again, this would just be the narrative, right? I think it has, wants to abolish basic ideas about differences between the sexes, that supports, abortion at any stage in pregnancy, that's hostile to the basic religious liberties of Christians, again, from the conservative Christian point of view. Is it Donald Trump's populism with its heathen cruelties? Is it transhumanism? Like, is the final boss of this era that religious believers will have to confront actually Silicon Valley? And if it is, like, can you make alliances within Silicon Valley? Is it better to be with Elon Musk and his 117 children than to be with, some other people involved?
He's also, Neuralink it's pushing transhumanism forward very fast.
All right. So that's the whole interview is great. You should really watch it. Anyway, I'm out of time. I'm done here. Leave a comment.